episode of the Trinisphere, where Timmy's, Johnny's, and Spike's battle over all things EDH. I am Shannon the Johnny, here with the deck tech I'm calling Orzhov's Deathmatch. As Johnny, one of the ways I build decks is I find obscure and underutilized artifacts and enchantments and build an entire list around them. Maybe this isn't the greatest way to build a deck because sometimes you just don't draw those artifacts and enchantments, but it's a fun exercise in deck building by trying to create archetypes that may not have existed before. Deathmatch is a 4-mana black enchantment that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield, its controller may have target creature get -3/-3 until end of turn. This fosters an environment that is extremely hostile to creatures surviving for any more than a blip of time. Every creature that comes in has the ability to bring down a pre-existing creature, so long as it's kind of small. This creates a pretty interesting dilemma. Do you commit creatures to the battlefield to bring down an opponent's bomb? Or do you hold back your utility creatures afraid they're going to get removed by incidental deathmatch triggers? But one deck that can definitely take advantage of this is any token-centric deck, able to put out a lot of expendable temporary creatures while bringing down important utility creatures in the process. When Tevesh, Szat, Doom of Fools was revealed from Commander Legends, I thought this might be a great opportunity to start building a deathmatch list. Tevesh, Szat, Doom of Fools is a 5-mana 4-loyalty commander with partner that says, for +2, create 2 0/1 black thrill creatures. Now, being 0/1s, they're pretty much worthless. They can block, but also they can trigger deathmatch, so they're great fodder. For +1 loyalty, Tevesh, Szat can also sacrifice another creature or planeswalker to draw us 2 cards, and if it was a commander, we can draw an additional card. So this is really cool in that it is a Skull Clamp in the command zone. It might not be as easily abused as Skull Clamp because it can only be used once per turn, but it's a great source of draw power, especially in a world where we have a lot of expendable creatures that we don't care about. Lastly, Tevesh, Szat's ult says, gain control of all commanders and put all commanders from command zones into play under our control. So while this is pretty cool, it may not necessarily close out the game depending on what commanders we're playing against. A lot of niche commanders that require artifacts in the graveyard or something like that may be pretty much worthless under our control, but this also is a crippling effect towards our opponents who built their decks around their commanders themselves. Now, I waited very patiently for another commander to come out, a partner specifically, that could pair with Tevesh, Szat from Commander Legends. And while the other Planeswalker did not have anything to do with tokens, Jessica, thrice touched by infinity, we did get Prava of the Steel Legion. This 3-mana 1/4 cat soldier says, as long as it's your turn, creatures you control get a +1/+4, and for 4 mana you can create a white soldier creature token. So this being a creature is not necessarily ideal in a deathmatch list because it's susceptible to deathmatch itself, but it's got a lot of upside. For one, it has more than 3 toughness, so it can dodge incidental deathmatch triggers. Where an opponent's trigger a deathmatch, they scan the board looking for an easy kill, and Prava requires a second commitment in order to bring down. Also, Prava can create a creature at instant speed, so the way we can trigger our deathmatch on opponent's turns. So if they have a utility creature that is going to be contingent upon going off, we can quickly activate Prava and bring down that creature before they go infinite. Now, while Prava does give our creatures +1/+4 during our turn, it's not as relevant in the world of deathmatch. More than likely, our opponent's deathmatch trigger is going to be happening on their turns when we no longer have that toughness buff, but the rest of this list is going to be committed to killing players with tokens, so getting +1 power is not terrible. Also, Prava being a 3-mana 1/4 is going to be very relevant because we're going to be running a Superfriends list, and having an early game blocker that has 4 toughness will be relevant to keep our planeswalkers alive through the mid game. So I'm a big fan of Superfriends. We're going to be generating a lot of tokens. We're going to use Anthem effects to improve the value of our tokens, pushing them from nuisances into the lethal danger range, and a ton of removal focused on keeping the board clear of relevant creatures. Let's first talk about our token generators. We have a Johnny Strength of Pride, Bitter Blossom, Dread Horde Invasion, and Elspeth Tyrell. Both of those 2-mana enchantments are great at coming down early in the game and starting to produce a steady stream of blockers that can help defend subsequent planeswalkers. These 2 planeswalkers I mentioned are very similar in the design. Both of them on the uptick can gain us some amount of life. Both on the downtick create some number of tokens. A Johnny creates a 2/2 a Johnny Pridemate that gets a +1/+ counter whenever we gain life, whereas Elspeth Tyrell just creates 3 1/1s. And then lastly, both of these have an ult of sorts that wipes the board clean. Elspeth Tyrell's ult says destroy all other permanents except for tokens and lands. So this one's a little unfortunately counterproductive in that it blows up our other planeswalkers, but this is our oh crap reset button. If somebody has gotten really far ahead with enchantments or artifacts, we can use Elspeth Tyrell to set them back to the Stone Age, or just level the playing field. A Johnny is a little bit different in that a Johnny exiles all artifacts and creatures, so it doesn't affect enchantments as well, but does exile things to kind of hamper those reanimator decks. A Johnny can also only activate his ult if we have 15 or more life than our starting life total. So this is why there is some incidental life gain throughout this list. For other token generators, we got Elspeth Knight Errant, Elspeth Sun's Champion, Elspeth Sun's Nemesis, and Feldar Retreat. All of these are very great at generating tokens. Elspeth Sun's Champion, one of the best in the biz when it comes to Super Friends. On the uptick, tick creates 3 1/1 white soldier creatures. On the down tick, -3, destroy all creatures with power 4 or greater, so all relevant creatures. And then -7, we get an emblem that says creatures we control have +2/+2 in flying. Basically a game-winning emblem right there, turning our tokens into flying hill giants or worse. Fellow Retreat is one of those new retreats from Return to Zendikar. And it has landfall, create a 2/2 white cat, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control and give them vigilance. So this is a great way to start improving the deadliness of our board over the span of turns. And we do have a few fetches in here so we can trigger it kind of more at a more rapid rate. This is great in the late game at pumping a large army of tokens to lethal, and great in the early game, starting creating blockers or starting to amass an army to pump later on. We're also going to run Oath of Gideon and Sorin's Solemn Visitor. I like the oaths a lot, and this 3-mana oath gives us 2 creatures on entering the battlefield, so great preceding planeswalkers. And then each subsequent planeswalker we play gets an additional loyalty that could come in kind of relevant with certain planeswalkers. Namely, Elspeth Tyrell came in at 4 loyalty, but had a -5 to destroy all other permanents except for tokens and lands. Which means with Oath of Gideon, Elspeth Tyrell is kind of like a 5-mana planar cleansing. Our opponents really have very little opportunity to interact with that synergy. Sorin's Solemn Visitor is a 4-mana 4 loyalty planeswalker. They can create a 2/2 flying black vampire, which is one of our more aggressive tokens. The fact that it has some evasion makes it a great sink into a lot of other these planeswalkers pump effects. Speaking of which, Sorin's Solemn Visitor has a +1 to give all of our creatures +1/+0 lifelink. So a great way to generate some life gain triggers, get our life total over that 55 mark so our Johnny's Strength the Pride can trigger its ult, but also just push through a little extra damage, because that is going to be the main way we win the game, is by beating people to death with tokens. Speaking of ways to push through extra damage, we've got a ton of anthems in here. Things that just pump our board to make our 1/1s more deadly, or 0/1 thralls more deadly. Johnny's Steadfast, Bishop of Wings, Cathar's Crusade, and Divine Visitation start out this list. Johnny's Steadfast is a 4-mana 4 loyalty planeswalker that has, most relevantly, a -2 to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, and a loyalty counter on each planeswalker we control. So we're going to use that to, of course, increase the strength of our token army. Also, Johnny has, for +1, until end of turn, up to 1 target creature gets a +1/+1 for a strike, vigilance, and lifelink. So we can use that on that flying vampire, or maybe one of our other creatures or commanders to just push through some extra damage and gain some extra life. But also relevantly, the ult, which is a -7, we get an emblem that says, if a source would deal damage to you or a planeswalker you control, prevent all but 1 of that damage. So it reduces all incoming damage to 1 from each source. Bishop of Wings and Divine Visitation make it a combo in this Johnny list. Bishop of Wings is a 2-mana 1/4 human cleric that says, whenever an angel you control enters the battlefield, gain 4 life, which is not that relevant. More relevant is, whenever an angel you control dies, create a 1/1 white spirit token with flying. Whereas Divine Visitation says, whenever we would create a token, instead create a 4/4 angel token. These two work in conjunction. Bishop of Wings says, when an angel dies, create a 1/1 white spirit. And Divine Visitation says, whenever you create that spirit, instead create an angel. So now we have like an undying army of Serra angels. And that's the way we can quickly steal the game and be resilient to board wipes as well. Cathar's Crusade is a classic go wide win condition. This 5-mana enchantment says, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So this is great when we're able to put out waves of creatures. We roll up Sun's Champion to make 3 1/1s. Cathar's Crusade triggers 3 times, putting 3 counters on each creature we control, including each of those 3 tokens that just entered the battlefield. They'll be on the battlefield when these triggers are on the stack, so they will be recipients of their own +1/+1 counters. We're also going to round out this list with Elesh Norn, Grand Cenobite, Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, Humility, and Sorin, Lord of Innistrad. Elesh Norn is a great anthem, as well as a removal spell of sorts. It gives our creatures +2/+2, and our opponent's creatures -2/-2. Humility just levels the playing field by removing all abilities from all creatures and turning them all into effectively overpriced tokens. So what better way to overwhelm and outpace our opponents when they're having to cast 4-mana 1/1s, whereas we're just rolling up our planeswalkers to produce waves of them. But to talk more about anthems, Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, and Sorin, Lord of Innistrad are both great emblem generators. Gideon is a 4-mana 4 loyalty planeswalker with, most relevantly, a -4 that creates an emblem, giving our creatures +1/+1. Well, that sounds like a big investment. It's similar to Glorious Anthem. However, for 1 extra mana, 4 instead of 3 mana, we get an emblem instead of an enchantment. And an emblem is impossible to remove from the game. So this is something that we can use earlier in the game to set up later plays and slowly accumulate board state that is impossible to interact with. And that's really the bread and butter of planeswalker decks. Hard to deal with effects. Gideon can also create a 2/2 white knight ally, and this card works really well with Oath of Gideon. Once again, coming in at the additional loyalty means we can roll it down to create the emblem, and Gideon still lives, has 1 loyalty remaining, and then can just start producing 3/3 white knights for the rest of the game. Sorin, Lord of Innistrad, has a different emblem. For -2, we can create a Orcish Aura Flame. Creatures we control get a +1/+0. So even without Oath of Gideon, Sorin will survive the first tick down, and then can use the rest of its time to create 1/1 black vampire creatures with lifelink, which will be 2 1s with that emblem in play. But really, we just want to try and create as many of those emblems as we can before Sorin dies. The more we we can play, the more devastating our tokens in the late game become. Sorin also has a -6 to destroy up to 3 target creatures or planeswalkers and then put them back onto the battlefield under our control, which is a nice removal spell in a pinch. Okay, onto our ramp removal and draw. For our ramp package, we have a pretty standard set, with some extra emphasis because our curve is a little high, as most Super Friends lists are. I think the average planeswalker is around 4 mana. We've got our Signets, Arcane, and Orzhov, and we also got our Soul Ring and our Talisman of Hierarchy. Some additional 2-drop rocks we're going to run include Charcoal Diamond, Marble Diamond, and Mind Stone. And we're also going to run Mana Crypt and Mox Amber as our 0-drops. Mox Amber might not be very useful in the early game because the first thing we can cast that can turn it on is 3 mana, but it's definitely helpful in the mid game because, like I said, the average cost of a spell in our deck is 4 mana, so reaching 8 mana early on is kind of a big factor in whether or not we're going to be able to overpower our opponents. Being able to play 2 planeswalkers in a turn is way harder to deal with for our opponents than a single planeswalker per turn. We're also going to run Commander's Sphere, Ashnod's Altar, and Verge Rangers. Verge Rangers is that new 3 mana 3/3 that has first strike that allows us to look at the top card of our library, and as long as an opponent controls more lands than us, we can play a land off the top of our library. We were joking in a recent roundtable that the best way white ramps is by having green opponents. Onto our removal, we've got Anguish Unmaking, Austere Command, Cavalier of Dawn, and Damnation. So we have a lot of ways to deal with non-creature, or deal with any permanent threats. And Cavalier of Dawn, while being a creature, means it does die to deathmatch triggers, is one that's totally willing to do it. It's 5 mana 4/6, meaning it takes 2 deathmatch triggers to bring this down. Has an ETB trigger to destroy up to 1 non-land permanent and generate a 3/3 golem for that controller, which is totally fine because 3/3 is obviously very susceptible to deathmatch triggers. But also when Cavalier of Dawn dies, we return an artifact or enchantment from graveyard to hand. So this is a way that we can recur our deathmatch if it gets blown up by a cheeky opponent, or maybe like a Divine Visitation or Cathar's Crusade if we want a big game-ending enchantment. We're also going to run Day of Judgment, deathmatch, obviously, Generous Gift, and Karn Liberated. Just like Cavalier of Dawn, Generous Gift can turn any dangerous permanent into a 3/3 to just get clobbered by the next deathmatch trigger. We're also going to run Martial Coup, Oath of Kaya, Oath of Liliana, and Swords to Plowshares. Martial Coup can feel like a win more card in this list because very often the board state is going to be such that we have a ton of tokens and no way to push through a huge amount of damage. But Martial Coup is also an insurance policy. If they somehow deal with all of our planeswalkers and our tokens and effects, and we've managed to generate a lot of emblems throughout the game through Gideon and Sorin, Martial Coup can kind of be a backbreaking spell late game. We cast it for as much as we can, blowing up all creatures and then putting into play 3/2s, 4/3 creatures, depending on how many emblems we managed to create so far. The oaths are both great. Oath of Liliana is a lightning helix, deals 3 damage to any target and gives us 3 life, and also creates a tax effect. Whenever our planeswalkers get attacked, we take 2 life from the attacking player. Oath of Liliana is much better in that when it comes to play, each opponent sacrifices a creature. At the beginning of the end step, if we played a Planeswalker this turn, we get to create a 2/2 black zombie, untapped. So this is a great way to create blockers for Planeswalkers that couldn't create blockers for themselves, and it's very helpful once you reach that arch enemy status, where all 3 of the opponents are working against you at the same time. Lastly, for removal, we got Ugin the Ineffable, which really does it all. This 6 mana 4 loyalty Planeswalker says, for +1, you can create a 2/2 Spirit token and exile the top card of your library face down underneath it, and then when that token leaves the battlefield, you can draw that card. Also for -3, you can destroy target permanent that's 1 or more colors. So whenever you raid a Planeswalker, the 4 metrics I look for are, can it roll up to protect itself, which this does by creating a token? Can it generate card advantage, which this does by creating a token that draws you a card when it dies? Does it remove threats, which this does by destroying colored permanents? And then lastly, can it win the game outright with an ultimate, which just doesn't really have an ultimate? So this checks 3 out of 4 boxes for me. For our draw power, we've got Karn, Scion of Urza, Kaya Ghost Assassin, the Liliana Dreadhorde General, and Mangara the Diplomat. So Karn can also create constructs with power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts we control, but more relevantly, lets us dig through the top cards, lets our opponents get to choose what we draw, but the things that they take away from us, we can draw in subsequent turns, -1 in Karn. So this is a quick way to dig down for our win cons, assuming Karn survives long enough to draw them. Kaya Ghost Assassin has a bunch of weird abilities, but the last one is the most relevant. For -2, each opponent discards a card and we draw a card. So it's basically just a draw engine. Once we run out of loyalty, we can use Kaya's 0 ability to exile itself and put it back into play, resetting its loyalty to 5, and we lose 2 life in the process. The other ability about having our opponents lose 2 life and gaining 2 is not super relevant, but it's there. It's a way to kill somebody hilariously. Liliana Dreadhorde General is awesome. 6 mana 6 loyalty. Whenever a creature we control dies, token or non-token, we draw a card. It can plus to make zombies. It can negative to have each player sacrifice 2 creatures, and its ult basically ruins opponent's board states. They need to choose 1 of each permanent type, a land, a creature, an artifact, an enchantment, etc., and then they sacrifice the rest. So this should put them in a state where there's no chance they can win against us. Mangara the Diplomat, once again, can survive deathmatch at 4 toughness, and is a draw engine. Whenever they attack us and or our planeswalkers with 2 or more creatures, we draw a card, and if they play 2 spells, spells, we draw a card. So a nice draw engine. We also have Obnixilus Reignited, Phyrexian Arena, Skullclamp, and Yawgmoth Thran Physician. Obnixilus is basically in here as a 5-mana Phyrexian Arena that can occasionally blow up creatures. For +1, we draw a card and lose a life. For -3, we destroy a creature. Its ult creates an emblem that's not really that strong. You can only give it to one opponent, and that opponent now has, whenever you draw a card, you lose 2 life. That may not be able to close out games unless somebody's at really low life total, so we'd rather just draw cards for as long as Obnixilus is alive. Skullclamp's obviously going to be in this list because it's a better version of Tevesh Szat's +1 in that we can do it multiple times a turn. And then lastly, Yawgmoth Thran Physician is a 4-mana 2/4, so has a little bit of protection against deathmatch, has protection from humans, and has pay a life and sack a creature to put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 creature and draw a card. So more relevantly, we can pay life and sack creatures and draw cards as many times as we want. Additionally, for 2 black and discarding of a card, we can proliferate. So while that's usually used in synergy with the -1/-1 counter that this card also creates, proliferating is really good with Planeswalker. We can roll up all of their loyalty just by discarding useless cards out of our hand, whether they be lands or late game mana rock. All right, let's talk about our tutors. Some of our more powerful draw cards used to punch up the power level of this list because it is slow, as all Super Friends lists are. We've got Academy Rector, Arena Rector, and Jeru with Eyes Open. Academy Rector, really great, although very expensive nowadays. This 4-mana 1/2 says whenever I die, you can exile me to search for an enchantment from your deck and put it into play. So we can go obviously get Deathmatch, which this deck is built around, but we can also get things like Divine Visitation and Cathar's Crusade. Similarly, Arena Rector has the same effect, but go gets us a Planeswalker. So we can use this to go get some techie ones that we need to deal, because we kind of have a toolbox that we can use to deal with very many threats. We can go get Karn Liberated to deal with a permanent. We can go get Sun's Champion to generate a wave of blockers, or we can go get Knight Errant in order to pump 1 creature and give it flying to deal lethal damage to an opponent. The one thing I really like about this deck is that when these come into play, they create deathmatch triggers and can be targeted with those own deathmatch triggers. It kind of gives them effectively an evoke cost. We're also going to run Jeru with Eyes Open. This 5-mana 4/3 with Vigilance does not have that beautiful above deathmatch toughness. However, when it enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for a Planeswalker card and put it into our hand. And then if a source would deal damage to a Planeswalker, we prevent 1 of that. So if we can get an emblem down, Jeru will be great, as long as it can have enough toughness to survive a random deathmatch trigger. But more importantly, this is just another tutor, allowing us to get any Planeswalker to deal with any threat on the field. Lastly, I want to talk about my utility cards, some of the cards that make the list for various reasons. We've got Auriok Champion, Soul's Warden, and Soul's Attendant. All these cards are incidental life gain triggers because you're going to be making a lot of creatures throughout the game. And I like Auriok Champion because it has protection from black and red, which means it cannot be targeted by deathmatch. We're also going to run Blind Obedience, Kaya's Guile, Kaya, Orzhov Usurper, and Teferi's Protection. Blind Obedience just makes it harder for our opponents to keep up with our waves of tokens because their creatures come into play tapped. Kaya's Guile gives us a graveyard hate card, able to exile all cards from each opponent's graveyards as one of its modes, but also relevantly can make a 1/1 flying black-white spirit token, or make opponents sacrifice creatures. Lastly, it can gain us 4 life, and we can entwine this to do all 4. Additionally, in the graveyard hate category, Kaya Orzhov Usurper is a 3-mana 3 loyalty planeswalker that has a +1 to exile 2 cards from a single graveyard, and we gain some life if some of them are creatures. This can also exile mana rocks by exiling non-land permanents with CMC 1 or less. And then its ult is pretty underwhelming in that it deals damage to target player equal to the number of cards they own in exile, and we gain that much life. That ult's not very relevant. More importantly, we're just going to use this to consistently hose graveyard-centric deck. So this is kind of a toolboxy card to go fetch up in a pinch. And lastly, Teferi's Protection is our protection spell in case somebody casts like a Merciless Eviction to exile all planeswalkers or something. Maybe Cyclonic Rifts us. We can try and Teferi's Protection out of it because it takes a long time to rebuild some of these board states. Lastly, our lands. You're going to run the best mana base you can in white. So if you've got Revised Duels, run them. If you got Shocks and Fetches, run them. I'll mention some of the unique callouts unique to this list. Be running Castle Ardenvale. For 4 mana, you can tap this to create a 1/1 white human. So it's just a token generating land. We're also going to run Field of the Dead, which is an awesome card. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, if you have 7 or more lands with different names, you can create a zombie creature. We're going to run Hall of Heliod's Generosity as another way to recur our deathmatch or other enchantments that are useful for winning the game. We're going to run Nykthos, Shrine of Nyx, as a way to power out a lot of mana because generally speaking, we're going to have a lot of planeswalkers in play, so giving us a lot of devotion to white or black. Phyrexian Tower gives us the way to turn some of our tokens into mana. And lastly, we're going to try out War Room in this 2-color deck. This new land says you can tap me, pay 3 mana, and life equal to the number of color identities in your commanders have to draw a card. So this is pay 2 life, 3 mana, and tap to draw a card on a land. It may not be great, but it's an interesting new try. All right, that's a wrap on my Orzhov Deathmatch Super Friends list. I love Super Friends a lot. lot. It's one of my favorite decks to build. I haven't been building them as much recently, but I have been undertaking slowly over time the 32 Super Friends challenge. Build a Super Friends list of every possible color combination. And I feel like this will be my Orzhov entry going forward. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and be sure to like, subscribe if you want to see more staple heavy big beats decks by Timmy, or perhaps some more competitive tier, low CMC, highly interactive CDH list by Spike. Also hit the bell icon so you get a notification when gameplays featuring this list come out soon. As always, great minds brew alike.